We are about to start the morning lecture today. We are very honored to have Professor Soames to deliver his Master Philosopher talk series. He will give us two talks for this series. The first one is today, the next one is on the coming Monday. Before there's handout. Start his lecture today, I want to just briefly introduce Professor Soames to you. Professor Soames is a distinguished professor of philosophy at the Northern California University. Before he joined SCU in 2004, he has also taught at Yale University, Princeton University. He specialized in philosophy language, history of analytical philosophy. He published a lot of papers on in the field of philosophy language as well as history of analytic philosophy. He had published and edited more than 10 books within these areas. So his most recent publication include World Philosophy Made, 2-volume. I think that eventually will be 4-volume of analytic tradition in philosophy. But currently, we already got his first 2-volume published by the Princeton University Press. Rethinking Language, Mind, and Meaning, and also Analytic Philosophy in America, and the other historical and contemporary essay that is also published by Princeton University Press in 2014. Due to his academic achievement and contribution, Professor Soames was elected a fellow of the American Academy of Art and Science in 2010. Today, we're very honored to have Professor Soames to deliver his first talk of the series. Today, the title for today's talk is Cognitive Propositions, a case study of truth, error, and progress in philosophy. And we have print out a hard copy of the handout of his talk today. So if you pick up one from in front of the lecture room, and now we just we will give time to Professor Soames and welcome him to start today's talk. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for the introduction. I'm going to have a certain theme in my talk today, and that is how progress in one important branch of Western philosophy, and one which has been emphasized a lot in modern analytic philosophy, how that kind of progress occurs and what it amounts to. Now, the area of philosophy that I'll be talking about is the intersection of the philosophy of language with metaphysics and epistemology. And the goal of this kind of work, or at least the kind of work I'm currently most interested in, is to help lay the foundations of emerging sciences of human language and information. This has been an important stream in Western philosophy from the beginning, as Greek philosophy really began in a serious way. It evolved in part out of mathematics. How Plato's Academy, which was really the first university, had above its door that no one ignorant of mathematics enter here, and which had a curriculum which emphasized mathematics and astronomy prior to culminating in philosophy. And throughout the many centuries that have passed since then, one important branch of Western philosophy has engaged in the birth of sciences, from physics to astronomy to economics, to rational decision theory, to any number of things. And so I think philosophers have something important to offer, and I think that people in advancing disciplines have something to offer us. So I'm going to look at a kind of case study in that area today. So I'll begin. Progress in philosophy is often traceable, of course, to the thoughts of the great philosophers. But if you look at the thoughts of the great philosophers, they're always incomplete. They are always marred by certain errors, and they are always in need of expansion and revision by those who come later. I'm going to illustrate this theme with the work of Frege, Russell, and Kripke. I'll begin with a well-known passage from Frege used in establishing his distinction between sense and reference. This is what Frege says in the very first paragraph of the article that did that. Identity gives rise to challenging questions which are not altogether easy to answer. Is it a relation between objects, or between names of objects? In my Begriffsschrift, I assume the latter, namely names of objects. The reasons which seem to favor this are the following. A equals A and A equals B are obviously statements of different cognitive value. A equals A holds a priori and is labeled analytic, while statements of the form A equals B often contain very valuable extensions of our knowledge and cannot always be established a priori. Now, if we were to regard identity as a relation between that which the names A and B designate, namely their reference, the objects, it would seem that A equals B could not differ from A equals A, provided that A equals B was true. A relation would thereby be expressed between a thing and itself, and indeed one in which each thing stands to itself, but to no other thing. That's the end of the quotation. What he's doing here is constructing what he takes to be a reductio ad absurdum of the idea that identity is a relation between objects. He speaks of sentences, A equals A and A equals B, in which A and B are names or definite descriptions or other singular terms. His key point is that, my desk is messy. Key point is that these sentences can differ in cognitive value, even when the identity statements are true. He also cites the analyticity and a priori of A equals A versus the fact that A equals B may contain valuable extensions of our knowledge. However, this point was not well expressed, since for him, arithmetical truths, all of them, are analytic and a priori, although of course, many extend our knowledge. So he was not exactly precise on this particular point. He was more successful in focusing on what he called cognitive value. Two sentences are said to differ in cognitive value if and only if an agent may believe the proposition expressed by one without believing the proposition expressed by the other. This leads to a puzzle about propositions that predicate identity of pairs of things. Frege wonders, can one believe that A equals A without believing A equals B when A is in fact B? He assumes that if identity were a relation between objects, we couldn't believe one without believing the other. Taking that to be absurd, he suggests that identity can't be a relation on objects. That is a surprising conclusion, and his reasoning for it tacitly relies on an unstated premise, which is, I believe, premise P on page 1 of your handout. For all relations R and objects A and B, knowing that A bears R to B requires knowing what the relation R is, which in the case of identity requires knowing that it holds between every object and itself. The second thing it requires is knowing what the objects A and B are, so one can predicate the relation R of them. And 3, having a reliable way of determining whether the relation does in fact apply to those objects. For example, let me give you an example which he doesn't give. To know of persons A and B that A is older than B is to know that the relation older than applies to A and B if and only if A was born before B. 2, to know who A and B are in the sense of being able to identify each and predicate the relation of them. And 3, it requires being aware of finding a way of determining the birth dates of A and B. That's a standard kind of reasoning that I think he would go through. Now, but when the relation R is being identical with, that third requirement may seem unnecessary. That is, having a reliable way of discriminating whether the relation does apply to those objects. Frege assumes that if identity is a relation on objects, then the ability to predicate the relation R of A and B, knowing what A and B are, presupposes that one has already settled whether A is B. So if identity were a relation on objects, knowing that A equals B would just be knowing that A equals A. And Frege thinks that's obviously absurd. I want you to notice something about this argument. The argument, the first step is this. The argument extends to any relation that can be known a priori to apply to every object in itself, and identity isn't the only such relation. For example, let R be not being younger than. That doesn't apply to any, I'm sorry, that applies to every object in itself. So the argument that it isn't a relation on objects will be sound if and only if Frege's argument about identity is sound. So if we have a reductio of the idea that identity is a relation on objects, we have a reductio of the idea that there are any reflexive relations on objects. Now suppose further that we have two properties, being F and being G, that can be known a priori never to apply the same to the same object. We can always find two such properties. Then the relation not being a pair, one of which is F and one of which is G, will be knowable a priori to be reflexive, just like identity. So if Frege's argument were sound, this relation would not relate objects. But then the positive relation, being a pair, one of which is F and one of which is G, wouldn't be a relation either, since if it were, its negation would be a relation on object. This makes it hard to see how either being F or being G could be a property of objects, because if they were, we could define a relation on objects as we just did. since this threatens the idea that any properties or relations hold of objects, one might take this to be a reductio ad absurdum of what? Of Frege's attempted reductio ad absurdum about identity. This appears to be overlooked in the writing of this great philosopher, at least up to this point in the article. Now, the main problem with Frege's extension, Frege's argument about identity and our extension to it, is that we haven't made clear what a key concept means. What does it mean for something to be a property of or a relation on objects? Well, I would think it ought to mean that it is one that is true or false of objects, depending on whether those objects, have the relevant property or stand in the relevant relation. But that isn't what Frege's argument requires. His argument implicitly assumes a certain story about what it is to predicate an n-place property of an n-tuple of arguments, and what it is to know or believe that the property applies to them. The story is that it requires, and I'll use a technical term here, it requires directly predicating the property of the objects rather than predicting a related property of cognitive representations of the objects. Directly predicating a relation R of a pair of objects represents them as standing in that very relation. So when object A is identical with object B, to directly predicate R, that is identity, of the pair AA is to directly predicate R, that is identity, of AB. Okay. So next, consider the proposition that X believes that A are B. If the predication in the believed proposition is correct, namely that A are B is direct, then A and B are elements of that proposition, which are, and the proposition represents them as standing in relation R. So it'll be true at any possible world state W if and only if A and B would stand in that relation if W were the state that the world was really in. So when A and B are identical, the proposition that A are A just is the proposition that A are B. So of course, anyone who believes or knows one believes or knows the other. Since this argument applies equally for all properties and relations, Frege's position requires total rejection of this natural story that I've told, which is a bit surprising. So we need to examine it a little more carefully to see what we can make of it. All right. All right. For Frege, propositions are composed of senses or meanings of the words used to express them. Consider a proposition expressed by a sentence containing, say, by a sentence consisting of an n-place predicate P plus n singular terms. For Frege, this proposition consists of the sense or the mode of presentation of that predicate P plus the senses or modes of presentation of those n singular terms. The proposition that A are B predicates a complicated property. Now this, I need to say slowly so you can get a sense of what it means. Under this Fregean picture, the proposition that A are B predicates the following: determining a pair of objects standing in the relation determined by the sense of R, predicating that complicated property, of the pair of objects determined by the senses of the expressions A and B. That's quite a mouthful. That's his model for all predication. It has to be. Despite his focus on identity, his arguments for distinguishing sense and reference have nothing to do with which properties and relations are properties of or relations on objects. So how could we make the distinction? If not, we're not going to rely on that previous argument. Well, we can still establish a distinction between sense and reference. And the key argument for this distinction is that substitution of singular terms with the same referent in examples like 1, 2, and 3 on your handout preserves truth value, but not meaning. Okay? The thesis that the A and B sentences in those examples differ in meaning is rooted on 3 facts. First, one can understand both sentences and know what they mean without taking them to mean the same thing or even to agree on truth value. That, I think, is correct. Second, one who assertively utters the A sentence in one of those pairs would typically be doomed to say or convey something more informative than one would say or convey by uttering the B sentence of that pair. Third, one would naturally use the A and B sentences in belief ascriptions, A believes that S, in which A and B take the place of S to report different beliefs. If these points are sufficient for A and B, that is, those sentences to differ in meaning, then theses 1 and 2 on your handout, T1 and T2 on your handout can't jointly be maintained. The first one says the meaning of a singular term, a name or description, is the object to which it refers. And the second one basically says substitution of terms with the same meaning do not change the proposition expressed. But if that's the case, then we know that the meaning of a singular term cannot be its referent. That means we can't accept both of those theses. Frege accepts the second thesis and it rejects the first. Now, in one respect, this is a natural and correct choice. The correctness of this choice is evident for definite descriptions, the so-and-so. Because 2 descriptions can differ in meaning while designating the same thing, the meanings of descriptions aren't their reference. Instead, meaning or sense determines reference. It is the way in which the referent of a description is presented to one who understands it. Frege takes this mode of presentation to be a condition, satisfaction of which is necessary and sufficient for an object to be the referent of the term. Different descriptions with the same sense must have the same referent. Those designating the same reference can differ in sense, which is why the examples earlier in 1 and 2, the A and B examples, can differ in meaning. Now, Frege's distinction, this distinction here was an advance. It's something that in some form or other, we are going to need to hold on to. The question, and it's a deep question, is in what form do we need to hold on to it? Now, prior to Frege, we had little understanding of how to construct a systematic theory of linguistic meaning and language use. After him, we did. But his conception of propositions that was worrisome. Consider a proposition that represents 2 objects as instantiating a 2-place relation R. According to one way of understanding this, It is for an agent who entertains the proposition, that is, brings it before his mind, to have the objects in mind, and he then directly predicates R of them, thereby representing them as instantiating that relation. That's one way of thinking about it. According to another way of understanding predication, it is for an agent who entertains the proposition to predicate something more complicated, namely determining objects that instantiate R of the senses of the terms. When these are senses of descriptions, the F and the G, and R applies to pairs of objects, the proposition that the F bears R to the G predicates the property determining a pair of objects that stand in R of the pair of individual concepts, senses, the unique X that is F, and the unique Y that is G, which are the senses of those descriptions. Okay, so there's two ways of understanding how this representation comes about from propositions that people believe are assert. Given this, one may think that any relation R can occur in propositions in two ways. When it occurs in one way, it's directly predicated of objects, which are themselves elements of the proposition. When it occurs in the other way, it is indirectly predicated of the objects, thereby determining objects that stand in R of the senses that present these objects. Crucial point about Frege. Frege accepted only this secondary conception of propositions and predication. I believe, it's a long story, but that was a mistake. Although this picture works quite well for propositions in which descriptive senses rather than objects occur, Frege's rejection of all propositions that directly predicate properties of objects is questionable. All right. This, I think we're getting close to looking at some more examples. Yes. Frege regarded such object-centered propositions as absurd, impossible. For him, propositions are meanings of sentences which are composed of meanings of their parts. Predicating properties like being believed by John of propositions actually requires, on his view, higher level senses that are the modes of presentation of the lower level senses, which are themselves senses that determine other things like individual objects. Unlike individual objects, which can be cognized from different perspectives, you can look at a table from different points of view, via different modes of presentation, individual first-level senses have to, on Frege's account, inhabit a Platonic perspective-free realm. Because of this, their indirect higher-level senses must be unique. They must be fully revelatory modes of presentation of the lower-level senses. If they weren't, different speakers who agreed on the same lower-level sentences could diverge arbitrarily on higher-level modes of presentation, which would wreak havoc with the results that we would get in applying them to belief and knowledge statements of the form, A believes that Bill knows that so-and-so. The fact that Frege's semantics requires this hyperplatonism should prompt us to think of propositions in another way. Now, we're going to get 4 sentences here that are on your handout, which raise further worries. But let me first note, on your handout, they're labeled 4A and B. They should be 4A, 4B, 4C, and 4D. That's so you don't get confused later on. Okay, 4A. There's a planet which is such that the ancients asserted and believed when they saw it in the morning that it was visible only in the morning, while asserting and believing when they saw it in the evening that it was visible only in the evening. There, what we've got doing is quantifying into assertion and belief clauses. So what's left in the clauses is just a variable bound by quantifiers outside the clause. Now, we can get a similar result. Take 4b. The ancients believed and asserted when they saw me in the morning that I was visible only in the morning, while believing and asserting when they saw me in the evening that I was visible only in the evening. Imagine this. Imagine that Venus is has a consciousness and communicate with Mars. She could say that to Mars, and it would be true. And then the examples 4C and D, I'm going to leave for now. We might come back to them. Attitude descriptions like these involving bound variables, indexicals like I, me, you, he, it, and so on, or proper names in the complement clauses of these attitude descriptions can be true even when there's no true corresponding attitude description in which the complement clause expresses a Phrygian proposition. Why? Because in those cases, with the indexicals and the bound variables, all that gets contributed to the proposition is the object that they're assigned in the case of variables relative to an assignment. Okay. This suggests that the objects of these attitudes, namely asserting and believing, are non-transparent, object-centered propositions in which properties are directly predicated of objects rather than being predicated of modes of presentation occurring in transparent Phrygian propositions. These are propositions Frege has a very hard time with and never fully dealt with. The challenge for Phrygians is to provide an alternative analysis in which non-transparent propositions are merely artifacts derived from classes of related Phrygian propositions. That's going to be a big job. Why? Because not just any Phrygian propositions asserted or believed by the subjects of the attitude descriptions are candidates for deriving the needed non-transparent object-centered propositions. Now I'm going to talk about what was in the final two sentences. Suppose Richard Feynman, we've got a proper name here, was the most brilliant physicist of his era. For me to be correctly reported as believing that he, Richard Feynman, was brilliant, it isn't sufficient that I believe just any old Phrygian proposition, which has a sense denoting Richard Feynman. It won't be sufficient that I believe the Feynman proposition, that I believe this, the most brilliant physicist of his era was brilliant. That doesn't put me in any close enough relationship to have that belief about him. Rather, I must believe a Phrygian proposition that contains a sense that puts me in sufficiently close rapport with Feynman to allow me to be correctly reported to believe that he, Feynman, was brilliant. Some senses might qualify, but many wouldn't. And the challenge for the Phrygian is to define this distinction. It's a challenge he never took up, and which is not, I think, successfully been taken up, though attempts have been made. Another problem concerns something quite interesting: private, uniquely revelatory senses needed for an agent to have what are called first-person beliefs. it's plausible that each agent, you, me, A, whoever it is, has a way of thinking about you, me, A, whatever, that no one else could use to think about you, me, or A. But since Fregean thoughts are purely qualitative, agents whose qualitative experiences are the same should believe the same first-person propositions. Propositions that can be expressed by them as, I am so-and-so. But in fact, they don't. Here's an example. Imagine identical twins, Castor and Pollux, born 10 minutes apart, who are separated and kept in scientifically controlled environments. As a result of advanced technological engineering, every sound, every sight, every smell, every touch, every taste had by one of them is matched by a qualitatively identical experience had by the other. In fact, the two twins are even molecule for molecule identical. Both have learned the same words. Both utter the same sentences. And whatever one does or says, the other does or says that same thing in the next room where he's confined. Each has been told he has a brother, and each says to himself, I am older than my brother. But only one of them is right. Remember, they were born 10 minutes apart. For Frege, the two indexically expressed propositions must arise from two different qualitative, private, agent-centered Fregean thoughts. But since the cognitive perspectives of the twins don't differ qualitatively at all, then there can be no difference in the qualitative senses or thoughts they entertain. Thus, it appears that Frege can't accommodate object-centered propositions. After all, both propositions can't be true, because if one is true, the other is false. All right. Now we can do the same thing with time. So let's do it very quickly. Time indexed present tense thoughts about what is happening now, let's say. They raise, in effect, the same problem. It's plausible that for each time t, there's a present tense way of thinking about it when t is occurring. I can denote it by now, for example, which can't be used to think about t at other times. Imagine Rip Van Winkle going to sleep and being put in a cryogenic stasis. Years later, in 2022, he wakes up in the same place, feeling the same as he did before, looking at the same things, appearing in the same way, and having the same internal dialogue with himself as before. Unaware of having been asleep, he notices no change. He thinks to himself, it's now just about noon on November 3, 2002, exactly as he did a few seconds before falling asleep 20 years ago. The new thought, which Frege would take to be timelessly false, after all, must be different from the old thought, which was timelessly true. This is on the Fregean account of time. For the Fregean, this can be so only if some qualitative Fregean sense available to Rip now was not available to Rip before, but there is no such sense, which means that Frege cannot account for non-transparent, object-centered propositions. Okay, that's the central defect with what Frege gave us, despite the fact that he gave us many important things. So now we're going to turn to the next philosopher in this tradition. It's Bertrand Russell, who studied Frege and had a view which was in some ways similar to Frege, but in other ways, quite different. So I'll talk a little bit about Bertrand Russell. From 1903 to 1910, he worked on 3 projects. First, completing the reduction of arithmetic to logic that eluded Frege. Second, constructing his own account of propositions as meanings of sentences and objects of cognitive attitudes. And 3, applying our understanding of logic to natural language. I will focus on only the last 2 of those projects. In 1903, he developed a theory of propositions as meanings of sentences that represent things in the world as having various properties and so are true if and only if they have those properties. Since meaningful sentences are grammatically structured complexes, Russell took propositions to be structured complexes of the of the meanings of the subsentential expressions in the relevant sentences. Now, a sentence containing a name and a predicate expresses a proposition containing, for Russell, the object named plus the property predicated of it. For the object to be the meaning of the name, he thought one must bear a close epistemic relation to its referent, a relation that became increasingly demanding until 1910, when he treated all ordinary names not as real names, but as disguised definite descriptions. In 1903 and 1904, that wasn't his view. Then he took meanings of descriptions to be what he called denoting concepts. But they occupied the same positions in propositions that reference of names could occupy. When objects occurred there, properties in the propositions were predicated of them. When denoting concepts occurred there, properties were predicated not of them, that is, not of the denoting concepts, but of the objects those concepts denoted. That was his view prior to 1905. But he worried about it. He worried about it until he decided in On Denoting that there aren't and never could be any denoting concepts. He came to think that this was an incoherent notion, which would be, if it were true, would be pretty bad for Frege, because that's what all singular terms, in effect, express. His argument focused on the description, the first line of Gray's Elegy, a certain poem, which denotes the words, "The curfew tolls the knell of parting day." Russell maintained then, in On Denoting, that if the meaning of the description is what he previously thought it to be, namely a denoting concept, something on the order of a Fregean sense, then we should be able to give it a name. After all, it exists. We can just decide to name it. Let's give it the name M. He then presented his Gray's Elegy argument, focusing on sentences 5A, 5B, 5C on your handout. 5A, the first line of Gray's Elegy is the curfew tolls, the sentence is the sentence, the curfew tolls the knell of parting day. Yes, that of course that's true. B, the description, the words, the first line of Gray's Elegy means M. Well, we've just decided that we're going to name its meaning M. It's going to be some denoting concept. Why can't we name it? Of course we can name it. So that should be true. And then C, the same thing, the sentence, the first line of Gray's elegy, that's a kind of description, means the first line of Gray's elegy. And that's got to be false because the first line of Gray's elegy is the curfew tolls the knell of parting day. So we get two results in a way here. Propositions 5b and 5c, one is inclined to think, must be identical because they have the same structure and constituents. Remember, M is simply the meaning of what follows in 5c, namely the first line of Gray's elegy, that expression. So it's got to put that M up into the proposition that is expressed by that sentence containing it. So they can't differ in meaning if his earlier theory was correct. Okay, so that's raised a difficulty that he struggled with. Okay. So what does he conclude from this? He concludes that if descriptions are meaningful singular terms, their meanings, that is, denoting concepts, can never be objects of predication in propositions in which they occur. Okay? So that would rule out one of the sentences in our argument. Instead, their role is always to denote objects of which properties are predicated. Hence, Russell must deny sentence 5b and admit that there is no true proposition in which being what the description means is predicated of anything, despite the presupposition that M is what the description means. Okay? But this contradicts what seems to be the obvious truth, that no one can know of anything that it bears the property of being what the description means. But surely for any expression E to mean something, it must be possible to know of whatever it is, what E means, that in fact, that expression means it. Since this can't be true of meanings of descriptions, that is, denoting concept, Russell concludes that it's impossible for definite descriptions of any language, whether natural or artificial or logical, to be singular terms, period. The argument extends to all complex singular terms, even 2 plus 2. Now, that really can't be right. It's far too sweeping. So there must be some way of distinguishing those two sentences, 5b and c. For Russell, that can be done only if the propositions either have different constituents or different structures. Propositions are just structured combinations of constituents, okay? So if you have different propositions, it can only be because you've got different constituents or the same constituents in different structures. Can't be anything else. Okay. Now we know they have the same, 5b and c have the same constituents because M occurs in both of them. But that means that they can differ only if they have different structures. But how can they? What does structure even mean when we're talking about the structures of propositions? Do objects and properties occupy nodes in some kind of hierarchical or mathematical structure? How could that help? M will occupy the same nodes in both the proposition expressed by 5b and the one expressed by 5c. If structure could be visualized, you would see the same thing in both cases. when you were getting 5B and C before your minds. Because Russell took propositions to be abstract structures transparently brought before one's mind, he took Phrygian descriptions and other complex singular terms to be impossible. There must be no complex, even 2 + 2 is not a complex singular term. It's an ingenious argument, but it's unreasonable. So we've got to think more about it. Anyway, this was his chief motivation for the theory he presented on denoting in 1905. There, what does he do? He offers rules for replacing sentential clauses that contain definite description with clauses containing variables in the positions previously occupied by the descriptions. These variables are then bound by quantifiers outside the clauses. And Russell's rules for doing this translation, so to speak, seem plausible because they did detect a number of previously unnoticed ambiguities, and they yielded logical forms that produced some good results. Now, of course, there were some technical problems too, but the fundamental problem, which he didn't fully appreciate until 1910, was inherent in his view of propositions as abstract structures independent of the mind, the intentionality of which, namely of the propositions, was explanatorily prior to the intentionality of agents. That we must understand. For Russell, agents who entertain a proposition, bring it before their minds, cognitively represent things as being a certain way because the proposition does that. The proposition is the primary source of intentionality. And our minds are intentional only because we have a certain direct relationship with the propositions. But this required a clear conception of what these primitively representational entities are, of how we cognize them, and of why our cognizing them results in our ability to represent things as bearing properties. That's a tall order. And after realizing that he had no such conception of how this could work, he came to see that minds, not abstract entities, are the source of intentionality. Propositions are only intentional because of us. That's the way I would put it. Whereas before it had been looked at the other way around. But Russell at this point didn't understand how that could be, and so he got rid of propositions entirely, but he didn't have anything acceptable to put in their place. That's a pity, because there was something workable that was close at hand. The key was to invert the order of explanation, starting with the certainty that agents represent things as being various ways when they perceive, or when they imagine, or when they think of them as being those ways. Next, we ask, what kind of entity? Here's our basic question. What kind of entity P and what relation R can play the role of propositions and the relation of entertaining that we bear to them by virtue of the fact that for an agent to bear R to the entity of kind P guarantees that the agent represents things as being a certain way. Russell couldn't answer that question. We've got to find a P and an R that answers it, or forget about propositions altogether. Okay. With such a P and an R, we can explain the intentionality of entities of kind P by deriving it from the intentionality of agents who bear art in it. That's my idea. Okay. Let's see where this goes. When we put the problem in this way, there's an answer to the question, what are propositions and what is it to entertain them, that jumps out at us. Propositions are repeatable, purely representational, cognitive acts or operations, the performance of which results in concrete cognitive events. To entertain a proposition, now propositions are act types of a certain time. They're things we can do. To entertain a proposition is what? It's to perform an act of that type. All right. So think of it this way. Suppose I visualize a certain book B as being read. In so doing, I perform the act of predicating readness of it. That's what my imagination does, which is to represent B as read. The sense in which the cognitive act represents B as read is like the secondary sense in which we call some acts insulting or irresponsible, not because those acts do anything or fail to live up to their responsibilities. Acts don't do anything at all, and acts have no responsibility at all. And yet we call them insulting, some of them, and irresponsible. Why? Because the agent who performs these acts are insulting or irresponsible. Okay? The connection between this derivative sense in which representational acts represent and the primary sense in which agents who perform them represent is similar. We are interested in these acts because we often need to assess the accuracy of the agent's particular sayings or cognitions. For this, we need truth and falsity plus cognitive doings that represent things as being various ways, where the sense in which they represent is simply that performing them guarantees that the agents are the ones doing that. When to think of a given object, O, as P, is to represent O as it really is, we identify a particular cognition plus a property it has when it's accurate. The entity is the proposition, which is the cognitive act of representing the object as P. The property is truth, which the act has if and only if to perform it is to represent it as it really is. That's the fundamental story. So, to entertain a proposition is not, as Frege and Russell thought, to internally perceive it or to make it the object of one's attention. It is to perform the act. Entertainment in this new sense is the attitude on which other propositional attitudes are based. Very quickly, to judge that P is read is to perform the predication in an affirmative manner, which involves accepting it as the basis for possible future action. To believe that P is read is roughly to be disposed to judge that it's read. To know that B is read is for B to be read, for one to believe that B is read, and for one to be safe or justified in so believing. To assert that B is read is to commit oneself by uttering something to knowing that B is read. Okay, now back to Gray's elegy. We say that one who entertains, that is, performs, proposition 5b on your handout, truly predicates the property being what the words, the first line of Gray's elegy mean, predicating that of a certain meaning M. One who entertains, that is, performs, proposition 5c, falsely predicates that property of what M determines, namely the first line of Gray's elegy, which is what is the bell tolls the knell of parting day. One who entertains phi b directly predicates that property of M itself, which does have the property. So phi b is true. One who entertains proposition 5c indirectly predicates what the first line of Gray's elegy means of whatever is determined or denoted by meaning M. And how do we do that? This is accomplished by directly predicating of M, the property determining or denoting something, which is M. Since what M determines is the sentence, the curfew tolls the knell of parting day, which isn't what that very sentence means, 5c is false. The distinction between these two propositions is not a difference between the constituents of the two properties. It's not a difference of the way those constituents are arranged. It's a difference in what an agent who performs these cognitive acts uses the denoting concept M to do, namely to provide the object of a direct predication or determine the object of an indirect predication. If that's right, then we have what we need to avoid Russell's extreme conclusion that complex singular terms can't occur in any possible language. What we need is a distinction between what one who entertains, that is, performs, proposition 5b, aims to represent, versus what one would aim to represent in using 5c. This is the cognitive difference between direct and indirect predication. Instead of thinking of propositions as Russell did, as abstract structures, the entertainment of which involves bringing them transparently to mind by a kind of intellectual perception, we think of them as cognitive acts involving different kinds of predication, depending on what we aim or intend to represent. So they're more heavily dependent on us, so to speak. Finally, before turning to Kripke, we need to say a word about Russell's view that genuine names contribute their reference to propositions expressed by sentences containing them. And because they do, their reference are constituents of sentence meanings. Now, these ideas are arguably, they might be correct, they're arguably correct, but they couldn't be combined. They couldn't be combined with his ideas about naming and meaning. By 1910, he'd become a Cartesian about meanings, which he took to be things we can't be mistaken about. Since users of ordinary names of people, places, and things can be mistaken about what, if anything, they refer to, what we ordinarily call names can't, he thought, be logically proper, that is, genuine names. One reason he thought this goes something like this. Often when I use a word or phrase, I am certain that I mean something by it, even if I'm uncertain that what I mean is what the others mean by it. So if the meaning of the name I use is its referent, then I know both that the name refers and what it refers to. Because of this, Russell thought that the only objects I can name are those about which I can't be mistaken. And which objects are those? Myself, my thoughts, my sensations, and he added abstract Platonic properties. There are two large points connected with this seemingly small matter. The first is the clash between Russell's internalist conception of the objects of thought and the application of his theory of descriptions to propositional attitude sentences. Consider examples of types 6a and b on your handout, involving attitudes that relate an agent to the proposition expressed by a sentence S that contains a description, the D. So we've got 6A, A believes, doubts, asserts that S, where S contains a description, or 6B, A views wonder whether, A bears some attitude verb, let's say wonders whether S, which contains the description. It's crucial that the description can be interpreted. It's crucial to Russell as having what he called either large or small scope relative to the attitude verb. So interpreted, the theory tells us that the large scope reading of 6A is true if and only if this thing marked 6ALS for large scope is true, and similarly for 6B and 6BLS. These can be true only if A bears a cognitive relation expressed by the attitude to the proposition expressed by S, which contains the variable which has been left in the place of the eliminated description. When the variable functions as a temporary proper name for object O relative to an assignment of the unique object that in fact satisfies description D. The central epistemological doctrine of Russell's article, knowledge by acquaintance and knowledge by description, is that agents cannot bear any such cognitive relation to that proposition when the referent of X is a physical object, a physical person, a location. This doctrine has the consequence that all examples of the form 6ALS and 6BLS involving such objects are false, since the correctness of Russell's theory of descriptions depends on allowing many truths of that form. Russell's radical epistemological doctrine undermines his theory of descriptions, which is what brought him to fame in the first place. You cannot have both of these things. Though Russell's accomplishments on denoting were monumental, they occurred with a defective epistemology, philosophy of mind, and philosophy of language. His epistemology and philosophy of mind were essentially internalist and Cartesian, while his philosophy of language was individualist and subordinated to his epistemology and philosophy of mind. For him, language was a vehicle of thought in which sentences are paired with propositions that are the meanings they have for the particular user at the particular time. There was no passing in Kripke's sense of a name or a natural kind term with its externally derived content from one user to the next, resulting in the acquisition by agents later in the chain of communication of newly available propositional constituents occurring in newly entertainable propositions. There was none of that. There was no recognized linguistic division of labor in Hilary Putnam's sense, in which language is a social institution that pools the cognitive resources of community, making new thought contents available to individual agents, which otherwise would not be available. There was also little awareness of the dynamics of assertion or of other uses of language in which the use of a sentence S in a context often adds not one favored proposition designated as the meaning of S to one's store of beliefs and assumptions, but a group of related propositions arising from the interaction of the context of language use with the meaning of S. None of that. These features of Russell's philosophy were distortions of the nature of thought and language. However, far from taking Russell to task for this, I see his deficiencies as a measure of how far we have advanced our understanding of language and thought, which he helped us with immeasurably. Fortunately, his internalist and individualist deficiencies didn't seriously inhibit the progress he made in articulating a conceptual framework for connecting language and thought. Looking back today, we must not mistake his general perspective with ours, despite the fact that if it were not for him, we wouldn't have gotten as far as we now have. This brings me to my final philosopher, Saul Kripke. I begin with naming a necessity, the title of which prompts one to ask, what do names have to do with necessity anyway? Well, the answer lies in 4 aspects of his work. First, he established a close connection between proper names like Plato and China, and on the one hand, and common nouns like water, gold, and green, which stand for natural kinds. Second, he showed that names and kind terms are rigid designators, the reference of which is not determined by descriptions speakers associate with them. Third, he used essential properties plus rigid designation to show that many sentences containing them express necessary truths that are knowable only a posteriori. Fourth, he rejected the internalist perspective of Frege and Russell in favor of a social and externalist perspective. As we will see, of course, this doesn't mean that his advances were free of errors and unsolved problems. They weren't. Let's start with a characterization of a rigid designator, which is on the bottom of page, bottom of page 2, I guess, of your handout. Here it is. To say that a name rigidly designates an object O is to say that for any world state W, a sentence S containing the name, saying N is F, is true at W, is to say that if the world had been in that state, the proposition we actually here and now use S to express would be true if and only if X had the property expressed by F. And here's an intuitive test that you can apply. A singular term T is rigid if and only if the following sentence expresses a truth. The individual who is or was T could not have existed without being T, and nothing else could have been T. Okay? Put on your own proper name for that. Put in mine. Put in Quillen's. It'll work out. They'll be rigid. Now, Kripke's most well-known argument that the meaning of proper names isn't given by definite descriptions speakers associate with it was called the modal argument. It tells us that since names are rigid designators, but descriptions associated with them by speakers typically aren't rigid designators, then obviously names and descriptions differ in meaning. All major counterarguments against this conclusion have failed. One attempt took the meaning of a name N to be a non-rigid description that is always given Russellian wide scope when it occurs in clauses governed under modal operators. That was shown to fail in an article I published in 2004. Different attempts have focused on 2 ways of rigidifying, that is, turning non-rigid descriptions into rigid descriptions. I put that in your handout on page 3. And what I'm not going to read those, there's not time for that. But if you run through them, they're going to show that none of these proposals work. None of the proposals, even those for rigidifying descriptions, will establish that names and descriptions have the same meaning. So that's something we can talk about in detail if you want to. But I'm going to take that for granted here now. These failures of the descriptive theories of names have driven many of us to the conclusion that the semantic content of a sentence S containing a name N is something like the least common denominator. It is the minimal content asserted and conveyed by uses of S in any normal context involving competent speakers. Since different users of N have different context and in different contexts of use that sentence to insert and convey information about the referent of N, despite vast differences in what they know or believe about it, the least common denominator for N is simply its referent. That's going to be its meaning. When you use S, you say something about the referent of N, no matter how much or how little information you or your audience have about it. The referent of your use of the name is determined by your intention to use it with the same referent as those from whom you picked it up as part of a historical chain of reference transmission. These ideas, plus Kripke's conception of essential properties, led directly to conclusions about necessity versus a priority. For Kripke, essential property of an object O is a property O could not lack in any possible circumstances in which O exists. A contingent property is a property O has, but could have existed without having. Contingent properties of mine include living in California and being a philosopher. Good candidates for being essential properties of mine are being human, having a brain, having a body made up of molecules, and not being identical to Saul Kripke. So for any name N, an object O, if N rigidly designates O, and a given proposition predicates the property F of P, then the claim that F is an essential property of P is the claim that necessarily if N exists, then N is P. Now, if you look towards the bottom of page 3, we can take this Kripke type route to the necessary a posteriori. All of the sentences 7, 8, 9, and 10 will be examples of it. So what's the general thought? We let P be a true proposition that attributes a property or relation F to an object or series of objects conditional on the object existing, while not attributing further properties or relations to anything. Suppose we have that. Then P, that proposition, will be an instance of the necessary a posteriori. It'll be something that is necessarily true, that couldn't be false, that no matter which state the world could have been in, it's true, but it's knowable a priori if 3 conditions hold. And that's near the bottom of page 4. Condition A, it is knowable that F is an essential property of O if S is a property of O at all. B, knowledge that O has F, if it exists, can only be a posteriori. And C, knowing P involves knowing that O is F if it exists. Now, the sentences I pointed out earlier, 7 through 10, fit this model, as do many other examples of the necessary a posteriori that are given in naming and necessity. Here's the key fact that I want to communicate to you, though. The explanation can't be applied in the way I just described to some of Kripke's central examples. And these include 11A and 11B. I'll just take 11B here, Hesperus is phosphorus. Kripke does try to apply it. He does claim that that's an example of the necessary a posteriori, but his arguments for it fail. And it's important to see why. Okay. Now, the problem is that in these examples, condition B, knowledge that O has F if it exists, can only be had a posteriori, isn't satisfied in the case of Hesperus and phosphorus, since one can know a priori that if Venus exists, then Venus is Venus. And Hesperus and phosphorus simply don't get here. And the proposition is going to be involved on the same object taken twice over. So that is something which is a putative counterexample to what Kripke claims. Well, clearly, something has gone wrong. Before I diagnose the error, I'll say a word about what I take to be the positive message arising from his discussion. The key idea was his distinction between epistemic and metaphysical possibility, between ways things could conceivably be versus ways they could really be or have been. Metaphysically possible world states are not alternative universes, they are properties. Metaphysically possible world states are ways the real concrete universe could have been. They are properties it could have had. Epistemically possible world states are ways the universe can coherently be conceived to be, properties it can be conceived as having that one can't know a priori that it doesn't have. Just as there are properties that ordinary objects could have had and others they couldn't have had, so there are properties that the universe could have had, metaphysically possible world states, and other properties the universe couldn't have had, metaphysically impossible world states. Just as some properties of objects, just as some properties couldn't have had, some properties that objects couldn't have had are properties that one can conceive them as having, and that one can't know a priori that they don't have. So some properties the universe couldn't have had are properties one can conceive it as having that one cannot know a priori that it doesn't have. On this picture, which Kripke didn't articulate, and I think may not have fully seen, the reason empirical evidence is needed for knowledge of necessary a priori truths is to rule out metaphysically impossible, but epistemologically possible world states in which they're false. Now, this brings us back to identity statements, which is just a return to Frege's problem in another form. The argument for the a posteriority of the claim that Hesperus is phosphorus is given in the last few pages of lecture 2 of Naming and Necessity. It relies on the fact that the evidence available to one who understands both names is insufficient to determine that they are co-referential. Kripke illustrates this by noting possible world states W in which the users of the names are in evidentiary situations qualitatively identical to ours prior to the astronomical discovery. And yet in W, the names refer to different things. There's a little quote from Kripke at the top of page 4, which spells that out as I just did. Now, his example about Hesperus and phosphorus shows that the evidence available to us simply by being competent users of the two names doesn't establish 11C, that the name Hesperus and the name phosphorus are co-referential, and it doesn't establish 11D, that the sentence Hesperus is phosphorus expresses a truth. It doesn't establish that knowing that is knowable only a priori. Okay. But the lesson he draws is that, it does establish that those are knowable only a posteriori. But the lesson he draws is that proposition 11b, that Hesperus is phosphorus, isn't knowable a priori. His argument is unsound, since the proposition expressed by 11b, namely Hesperus is phosphorus, is true at all metaphysically possible world states. It's true at all such states in which agents are in epistemic situations qualitatively identical to ours, even when the proposition they use, the sentence Hesperus is phosphorus to express, even when that proposition is false. Although we and they need evidence to rule out the possibility that the two names are co-referential and that the sentence is true, it's not been shown that the true proposition we actually express by our use of the sentence Hesperus is phosphorus requires such evidence. Kripke didn't show that we can know Hesperus is phosphorus only a posteriori. To do so, he needs an unstated premise, something he left implicit. In the passage, he exploits a familiar connection between understanding and accepting sentences and our use of those sentences to report propositions believed. Before the astronomical discovery, agents understood but didn't accept and wouldn't have been justified in accepting the sentence Hesperus is phosphorus. So it's tempting to think that they didn't know that Hesperus is phosphorus because they lacked the necessary empirical evidence. But his argument for this, which is on the middle of page 4 of the handout, is unsound. Again, I won't read through this. We can talk about it later if you want to know why it's unsound, but I'll just say that what it requires is this principle called strong disquotation and justification. So how does that work? I won't read that one either, but I'll kind of tell you what it does. One who understands the sentence Hesperus is phosphorus, associating the names with the heavenly bodies seen in the evening and the heavenly bodies seen in the morning, will justifiably accept the sentence and believe it to be true, if and only if that person justifiably believes that the heavenly body seen in the evening is the heavenly body seen in the morning. Since justification for this belief requires empirical evidence, this supplementary premise, which he doesn't state, namely strong disquotation and justification, transfers the justification required for accepting the sentence Hesperus is phosphorus and believing it to be true to justifiably believing the proposition it expresses. Assuming this, we conclude that we can only know this proposition a posteriori, but this is a mistake, because if you look at that proposition, if you look at the two biconditionals in that supplementary premise, the left to right direction of those if and only if clauses of that premise, those are false. In lecture 3, Kripke extends that same flawed explanation of the necessary a posteriori to identity statements containing common nouns like heat and water that designate natural kinds. So heat is mean molecular kinetic energy, water is H2O, or it could be even groundhogs or woodchucks. Okay. Now, think of it this way. Proper names are introduced to refer to rather than describe some person, place, or thing. Later uses pick it up from earlier users, intending to use it to refer to the same things that earlier users do. Over time, a socio-historical chain of reference transmission occurs in which the shared semantic content of a name, namely its referent, is preserved even though different competent users associate it with varying information or misinformation. The story is the same for common noun natural kind terms, except for how they are introduced, which is often a gradual process involving multiple people. Typically, kind terms are introduced after noting similar observed characteristics of similar things. And the presumptions guiding this introduction are presented on page 4 of your handout as P1, P2, and P3. That, in essence, is what Kripke was getting at. If it's accurate, there should be many necessary truths, including those in 13, which are listed there, that are knowable only a posteriori. So that's solid. But whatever we say about these, we still have the problem with 12A, B, and C, which are just recreations of the Hesperus phosphorus problem for natural kind terms. Although Kripke seems not to have been aware of this problem in naming a necessity, he did investigate it 9 years later when he published A Puzzle About Belief. The core of the puzzle concerns the nature of propositions as things believed and the relationship between propositions and the sentences that express them. Typically, we have assumed we can uniquely specify propositions using the construction, the proposition that S. We have assumed that for each unambiguous sentence S, uses of the phrase, the proposition that S, designate a single proposition that doesn't vary from use to use. But Kripke's discussion in A Puzzle About Belief belies this. There he introduces a formerly monolingual Frenchman, Pierre, who moves to London and learns English by immersion, without learning that Londres translates London, and hence without learning that Londres est joli translates as London is pretty. Although Pierre understands the French sentence as well as any monolingual Frenchman, while understanding the English sentence as well as any monolingual Englishman, he sincerely assents to the French sentence while sincerely dissenting from the English sentence. Kripke then asks the question, does Pierre believe that London is pretty or not? He demands a simple yes or no answer. Refusing to provide one himself, he argues that any direct answer faces seemingly disqualifying difficulties. At one point, he says, when we're considering this problem, we enter into the area exemplified by Pierre. Our normal practices of interpretation and attribution of belief are subject to the greatest possible strain, perhaps to the point of breakdown. So is the notion of content, so is the notion of content of someone's assertion. That is, so is the notion of the proposition it expresses. This puzzle is supposed to make us think that the notion of proposition itself, as things believed and asserted and known, is itself in danger. But really what's in danger is old conceptions of propositions. If we have a new conception of propositions, we can make sense of this. Earlier in my discussion, I sketched a conception of propositions that Russell adopted, different from that Frege adopted, and also different from what Frege adopted, but incorporating elements of each. According to this new conception, propositions are repeatable, representational cognitive acts or operations, the performance of which results in concrete cognitive events. To entertain to entertain a proposition is to perform it. Every performance of cognitive propositions represents specific things as being specific ways. Hence, they are true if those things are those ways. That is the representational content of the proposition. However, many propositions also have cognitive contents that place conditions on how the objects and properties are brought to mind. Suppose we start with the act of predicating being pretty of London, imposing no special restrictions on how it's brought to mind. Since there are ways of thinking of London, many ways, the more general act of representing London as pretty can be performed by performing the act of bringing London to mind linguistically using either English or French. It can be brought to mind by perceiving parts of London or recalling past images of London. The representational content of all these acts is simply to represent the city as being pretty. But the different cognitive ways of reaching this result provide different cognitive contents. These ways of bringing London to mind are modes of presentation, but unlike Fregean modes, cognitive modes of presentation don't themselves enter into the representational contents of propositions. Like Russellian propositions, the representational contents of cognitive propositions involve objects, predications of objects, rather than predications of Fregean type sentences. Now, I believe I've used up my time, and I think it might be best if we stopped here. If anybody wants to pursue this last bit about cognitive propositions and Kripke's problem and how they relate to the conceptions of Frege and Russell of propositions, we can do that. And when we do, and we get back to Kripke and we ask, Kripke wants a yes or no answer to a simple question. Does Pierre believe that London is pretty or not? And my suggestion will be, you can't give a yes or no answer for a simple reason. The sentence he used, the sentence he expressed, together with the story he told, doesn't determine a single question. There are many different questions depending on which parts of the story we focus on when we're trying to respond to that interrogative sentences. And these are corresponding to different propositions which represent the same thing as being the same way, but they impose different conditions on the cognitive operations that were used to perform that proposition. So if we have this new conception of propositions that takes elements from both Frege and Russell, and we go and look at Kripke's final problem, which he was correcting an omission and an error in lecture 2 of naming a necessity, we'll be able to take those elements from Russell, Frege, and Kripke, put them together with this new fundamental type of proposition, and resolve the problems. That's the lesson that I see in this paper. And that's a lesson that I see going more broadly, not just talking about cognitive propositions, but when you look at analytic philosophy and the history of analytic philosophy, it is possible to go through this detailed reasoning, and you look at your predecessors, which brought out certain absolutely fundamental notions and made progress with them, and you can find where they run into a brick wall and can't solve their problems, but you keep working at it, and over time, their views, their hypotheses are modified, they're changed, there are new things that are added, but it's a system of cumulative progress that is not unlike the cumulative progress we see in many natural and social sciences. That's the lesson. Okay, let me shut up.
Okay, thanks, Professor Soames, for this very insightful and profound talk. Now we probably have about 20 minutes for Q&A. So if anyone online or anyone in the lecture room have any question, please raise up your hand. Or for the online audience, you can just give a signal to raise your hand. We can probably unmute it to your voice, so you can ask Professor Soames for your questions or comments. So any question currently from?
Now, the people who are just online, can they put a little hand up so that you can see that they have a question?
Yes, they have the button for that one, so they can raise a question, yes, if they want. Okay. Any questions? 下面有问题。哦，
Thanks for the lecture. I have two clarifying questions. The first one is the concept of the epistemical possible word state identical to the concept of the logical possible word state? If it is not, what is their difference and relation? And the second question is
Let's do one by one. Let's do one by one.
Okay.
But I need Quillen to repeat that for me because my sound is kind of blurry.
We just asked her to move to our microphone so that you can hear her voice clearly.
Oh, shall I repeat the first question?
Yes.
My first question is the concept of the epistemical possible word state identical to the concept of the logically possible word state? If
No.
it is not, what
No.
is their difference and relation?
A metaphysically possible world state is one thing. An epistemologically possible world state is another thing. And a logically possible world state is a still further thing. And the relationship between them is the set of metaphysically possible world states is a subset, a proper subset of the epistemologically possible world states, which is in turn a proper subset of the logically possible world states, if by logic you mean the kind of symbolic logic we have now.
Oh, thanks for your answer. I felt confused for this question because logically possible seems also means that it is conceivable to us, right?
Yes,
And it's
that means conceivability is the set of conceivable worlds is a subset of the set of logically possible worlds, yeah? Because remember, logically possible worlds involve what one might call, there's no relationship. There are no logical relationships between atomic sentences in logic. And the vocabulary is very important and it's subject to reinterpretations. So it's got to be a wider set of worlds than the epistemically possible worlds because there can be connections between the different vocabulary items in the latter, but not in the former. The term logically possible world is used very imprecisely in some of this literature. And even Kripke used it from time to time. But that was when this notion was just getting underway. And now we can see a much richer notion. And in my next lecture, I'm going to say a lot more about epistemologically proper, possible worlds. And you'll get a sense there of how they differ, how there's more of them than there are metaphysically possible worlds. And then you just have to take it one more step to get genuinely logical possible worlds. But there's a terminological sloppiness in the literature in using this phrase, logically possible worlds.
Thanks for your answer.
Second question.
I have the second question is also a clarifying one. My question is, you mentioned that Frege's argument has an unstated premise, just as shown in the first page of your handout. You say knowing that A are B requires knowing that the objects A, B are, so one can predicate relation R of them.
Yeah,
Do you agree that since the second premise might be wrong, we have no reason to object the idea that identity is a relation between objects? Did you reject such a premise?
did I reject the second premise? Is that the question?
Yeah.
Okay, now let's see where we have, oh, there we are. Which, okay, that's 1, 2, knowing what the objects A and B are so that one can predicate relation R of them. I am perfectly okay with that second premise, provided that you don't build in too much into the idea of knowing what the objects are. Frege built into the idea that if you know what they are, you've got to know whether they're identical. I don't, if you accept, if that's part of your premise, then I reject it. The only thing I accept is that we have to be able to identify A and identify B in some way or other, I'm not saying how, in order to predicate the relation of them.
Oh, I see. Thanks for answer.
Any further question?
Thank you, Professor Soames. I have a question concerning the worries. I was quite confused. What are those worries about? Are those worries about Frege's distinguishing sense from reference by rejecting T1 and accepting T2? Especially the 4.1 sentence about the planet.
Okay, let's see. Accepting T2 and rejecting T1. Now, I'm not, can you tell me, because I'm not remembering or I'm not identifying what kinds of worries you're talking about. Maybe that's what you're trying to ask. Now,
I was quite confused about especially sentence 4.1, and I think that sentence can be paraphrased as not as the way that you put on the handout, because for A presupposes that the ancients already asserted and believed that Venus, I mean the morning star and the evening star, are the same planet Venus, but from Frege's account, it seems that the ancients did not assert and did not believe that the morning star is the evening star. So I think that 4A can be.
That's what he would say. Yeah.
Yes. So I was confused. Why 4A is a worry for Frege if he thinks that the relation is
okay. Look, that's a good question. The relation when he talks about the difference between sense and reference, he talks about singular terms, names, definite descriptions, predicates, all these things. And he distinguishes their sense from their reference. Now, what do we have on 4A? What we have is, when will it be true? Well, let's see. It starts with, there is a planet which is such that. So when we have an existential generalization like that, we say that it's true just in case when you erase the quantifier and leave the open sentence that follows it with now unbound occurrences of variables, then there must be some assignment according to which it's true relative to what? An assignment of a temporary meaning to the unbound variables that you've gotten now that we've erased the quantifier. And what counts as meanings of variables relative to assignment? We don't assign meanings to the variables. We assign reference to the variables. And what I'm showing is that the same problem arises when the relevant singular term is by stipulation one whose only contribution to the semantic content of the sentence as a whole is what it designates, in this case, relative to an assignment. Now, if you wanted to make this if you wanted to try to make this work for Phrygians, you would have to assign senses that determine reference to variables, right? That's how it would work. But now what senses are needed? Well, you're not, if you end up with building in too much to the sense, then you're not going to get the truths that you want from the existential generalization, because although there will be some Phrygian propositions believed, there won't be unique ones, there won't be ones with the proper truth conditions, and so on. Frege was thinking, what does he start thinking? If the content of a name is its referent, then we're going to get these absurdities. But that means that we need something more fine-grained than a referent, so that co-referential terms of this type can differ in senses. And so he thinks, because all of his examples are examples involving names or descriptions or other complex singular terms, he doesn't think of how to deal with quantificational sentences, where the only thing we assign to the now freely occurring variable is a referent. And yet we get the same problem.
But for A can still be reformulated as two quantificational propositions, like there is a planet such that, not there is a planet, it's that the ancient just asserted and believed that there is a planet such that it shines in the morning and is only visible in the morning, and the ancients
and there is a
asserted and
planet
believed
such that they believed that it was visible only in the evening. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Two quantifications. Yeah, you can do that. That would
Yes.
be,
So
that would be easier for him. But there's nothing wrong with this one, which is a single quantification. It's true. And he can't account for the truth of it.
yeah, but it seems that the formulation of 4A presupposes that already it's not something about A equals B, it's something A equals A. And that the ancients' belief or ancients' assertion is a sort of the property of the planet Venus, but actually those beliefs and assertions might not be a property of the planet Venus.
Yeah, well, that's the point. Then you wouldn't do ordinary objectual quantification. You wouldn't replace the names with a quantificational variable, because the semantics of quantificational variables means that it's only Venus if they're assigned Venus as referring to Venus. There's nothing else to it. So you're going to get the result that I've got here in 4A, unless See, you can give other sentences in which it might not be so much of a problem, but this sentence, it is a problem. And all I need is one sentence in which it is a problem that Frege doesn't have a ready answer to. Of course, I can do many sentences like this, but they will have this characteristic. There's a reason I formulate it this way with one quantifier rather than two.
Okay, I see. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Anyone have any further?
Hello, Professor. I'm interested in the cognitive proposition part. To quote page 2.
Page 2. Okay.
In page 2 of the handout, propositions are repeatable, purely representational cognitive acts or
Yes.
operations.
Yes.
So I think this point is similarly problematic because we do not often evaluate acts as being true or false, but propositions can be true or false. It seems that propositions are actually representational content of the cognitive acts rather than itself is an act. So could you explain more on this point?
We do not ordinarily think of the things that are true or false as acts. Certainly in philosophy, we haven't thought that. Now, on the other hand, suppose we have the act of assertively uttering a certain sentence, a certain kind of use of a certain sentence. Maybe the statement there is the use of that sentence in that way. And we're perfectly fine saying uses of sentences are true. Now, there may be other cognitive acts which can be true or false, which don't involve language. I suspect there is, but the simplest case is the case of uses of linguistic items that have acquired meanings so that whenever you use them, you're counted as bearing a relevant relation to something which represents things as a certain way and hence will be true or false if the things are that way. The question you're asking is one that I struggled with for quite a long time because it's so different from the way that philosophers have normally talked about propositions. But I think there are cases in which it comes close to what we ordinarily say. And I think that if we take propositions in general to be this way, we can solve a lot of the unsolved problems that have existed for 150 years. Sometimes, just as in science, we need something that doesn't seem to fit common sense exactly, and we need to introduce something new. I think that's true here.
Yeah, thank you for answering. I think I'd like to know more about it. Yeah, that's a very interesting idea to me. Yeah.
Well, I've got a
Thank you.
book on the subject if you want to read it.
So which book can you?
It's called Rethinking Language, Mind, and Meaning, Princeton Press, 2015. Rethinking
Okay, thank you.
Language, Mind, and Meaning.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I will read that book. Thank you.
Well, that's good to hear.
Thank you. So, is there any further question and comments? We are about to run out of time already. 2 hours lecture. I think it's already 9 o'clock at night in LA time, right? So
It's 9 o'clock, yes.
probably we have yeah, we had to stop here and thank Professor Soames again for his insightful talk today. And on next Monday of Peking time, and that will be the night 7 o'clock at night for LA on Sunday of the LA time. We will have the second lecture. It's called the awareness lessons occurred. But we can send initially. So all of our audience online or in the classroom will welcome again to attend that lecture. And once again, please join me to thank Professor Soames for today's talk. So we will end here. Thank you very much.